All right, folks, welcome to the OFM podcast where metabolic health matters. I'm your host, Peter Defty, General Manager of Vespa Power Products and the guy behind developing the OFM program. And today we have on an athlete I've been working with for several years, James Hughes, who's out of Virginia. He's in Virginia on the East Coast. He's 71 years strong and has a great story, a great OFM Vespa story, but also just a great story in general because this guy is super relatable to not only all you athletes out there, but the general population. So we're going to dive in with a podcast conversation to augment his hero thing. If you see his hero thing and want to learn more, this is the place to have it because we're going to have a pretty in-depth conversation because James is a pharmacist by trade, been in the business for ongoing, how many decades?
Almost 30 years.
30 years as a pharmacist. So he's seen a lot of change that we're going to be talking about in healthcare. And we're going to have an open, no holds barred conversation on what's going on, not just with his own journey, but with healthcare in general, metabolic health. Should be a good day. So James, welcome.
Thank you.
All right. So tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, as you pointed out, I'm a pharmacist. I not only practice regular pharmacy, but I also like to do formulations and compounding, and particularly like to get into stuff that's applicable to the endurance athlete.
So you're a compound pharmacist as well as a general pharmacist?
Correct, yes.
Fantastic.
Compounding pharmacist, formulator. Have actually helped formulate a product that a lot of the Tour de France teams use. And we've worked on things that most of my interest is things that can be used as an adjunct in your training or just makes you better as an endurance athlete. But one thing when you were in the intro talking about healthcare and how things have changed and how long I've been a pharmacist. So I went to the Medical College, Virginia, which is in Richmond, Virginia. And back in the early 70s, there was a pretty significant pharmaceutical company called A.H. Robbins that was right in Richmond. And one of the highlights of going to pharmacy school was you got to tour the facility. And it just was kind of overwhelming seeing the research people that they had there and the things they were working on. But back in those days, they were looking for cures for disease. And now that if you fast forward 30 years later, A.H. Robbins has been bought out by Wyeth and Big Pharma. And now to work for a major pharmaceutical company, your area of research is not directed toward cures. They're looking for customers. They want a drug that will manage your condition for the rest of your life. And that kind of a lot of my colleagues in pharmacy and in medicine, it kind of is disturbing that we're not looking for cures. We're just looking for customers. And we try to manage diseases instead of trying to eliminate them. And that's been a significant part of my journey because, I went to OFM because I wanted to manage metabolic syndrome. I wanted to cure it. And from Dr. Mark Cuccizella's seminar, the only proven treatment that will eliminate metabolic syndrome is an OFM approach. And I'm living proof that 18 months later, I've completely eliminated metabolic syndrome. So I just wanted to throw that in about Big Pharma.
Yeah, you're not the only person who said that to me. So It's interesting. So let's talk about you as an athlete too.
Yeah, so one significant thing for me that kind of stumbled on as I went through the OFM journey
When did
is
let's back up a little bit more. When did you start
okay.
being a regular athlete?
So I did my very first triathlon in 1990. It was a sprint triathlon in a city about an hour away from me. I'd never been exposed to swimming. I'd ridden a bike some, but my background was a running background. You know, I wasn't tall enough to play basketball, so I got put on the cross country team and learned that, hey, running is fun, which confuses a lot of people. But from running to, and now the discipline that I love more than of any of the three is the bike. Because when my friends play golf on the weekend, golf just makes me mad. I go on a 3-hour bike ride, and and, to be able to enjoy a 3-hour bike ride is you have to be predominantly burning fat, not relying on sugars. So
Yeah, but most cyclists are relying on glucose and glycogen.
yeah, I know, and I'm trying to convince a lot of them and a lot of my buddies that you wouldn't believe how much sugar you consume just during a race, and how much better you can do if you were burning fat. Interesting point that the scientists used to say that we have enough stored fat to do 5 full Ironmans back to back to back. And people said, yeah, that's kind of cool, but you can't prove it. Well, Jason Lester, who only has one arm, a few years ago, he was, I can't remember the exact year, but he was ESPN's Athlete of the Year. But he did 5 full Ironmans on 5 consecutive days on 5 different Hawaiian islands. And he pretty much proved to the world that yes, you can burn fat and be very successful. And in my journey, I was always bonking on the run, no matter what product I tried, no matter how precise I tried to dial in my nutrition, I just couldn't do it burning sugar. And once I converted to burning fat, not only did I feel better, not only could I actually run the last piece of a triathlon, but I actually even started moving up in my place. So instead of a middle of the packer, I know that when I enter a race, if I execute my plan correctly, I have a shot at the podium.
How many Vespas do you take normally in a full Ironman and a half Ironman?
Well, what I do, from the beginning of the race, I consume Vespa every 90 minutes. The equivalent of 1 pack of the C25. I use the concentrate predominantly because it goes into my little mix that I carry with me. And then I even add some C25 to get some liquid volume. But I'm consuming, I would say probably the equivalent of 1 concentrate every 90 minutes from start to finish. And that has been significant.
And what has that done in terms of reduce your calories for race level conditions? Is it like 30%, 50% of what you used to have to take in?
I have a mix that has some carbs in it,
Right.
but I try to maintain, and some people said this is crazy, but 9 to 10 grams an hour, and that's almost nothing.
That is nothing.
Yeah. I also use some UCAN, which I don't count those carbs because they're slow carbs. But anything.
Yeah, those they count. They just don't spike.
Right. Yeah.
They count. Yeah. So in other words, if you're using 10 grams an hour plus you can, you're probably 50% of what you used to use in triathlon.
Oh, easy. Probably, more like 35 to 40%.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
Yeah.
So big reduction.
And no bonking.
Yeah. And podiums.
Right. Yes.
Yeah.
That makes racing a lot more fun.
Yeah. And what about how do you feel at the finish and the days after? Just curious what that experience was like.
Yeah. So, after, what surprised me is after a full Ironman, the next day I'm not totally wiped out. I mean, yes, I'm sore, but you're not just totally fatigued. Your muscles are sore; they're not aching. I remember when I first time I did a, a full marathon, I had to walk down the steps backwards because my quads were so trashed. And you have none of that from now when I'm not burning all this sugar and burning fat. And, the Vespa significantly helps with the recovery process. But you just don't feel totally wiped out even after a really long race.
Yeah.
It's gonna be interesting to see how I feel after this 40-mile trail run, because there's some significant climbs in there. But I still expect, a full Ironman. I'm out there 12 to 14 hours, and for this, I'm going to be out there the same amount of times. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out.
I think you'll really enjoy it. I think you'll fall back in love with running. It'll kind of compete with the bike now, because there's something about running on the trails that's just magical. Even though you suffer, it's still magical.
Oh yeah, I mean, I'm fortunate. I live right beside Shenandoah National Park,
Oh,
and I've
wow.
been all over those trails. I call it fast hiking. And now they're starting to be ultra races on the same trails that I used to, run, walk, hike on when I was in high school and college. So it is getting out there in the wilderness, even if you're by yourself. It's just therapeutic.
Absolutely. It's huge. And I don't think that there's enough emphasis on humans getting back into the natural environment. I think we've ensconced ourselves in this man-made construct, and it's artificial, and it's not only clouding our decision making, but I think it's frantic, and I think there's a lot of pinging of primitive fight or flight hardware, chronic pinging was never meant to happen as a result of all these sort of tools we have to make our life better. It's like I'm finding that tools are tools, right? They have a benefit, but they can also be used for unintended consequences.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it's the same with pharmaceuticals, right? There's a lot of good drugs and therapies have been developed, but you've got to use them prudently, because almost all of them, unless they're natural, there's usually unintended consequences, right?
Oh, yeah, and the more that we use them, the more we learn. I think about my dad, who lived to be 93, and he was the first male Hughes to ever make it out of his 60s. And there were medications that had a huge impact on him. Number one was a statin. But now we're finding out that there's also some problems with the statins and some of the metabolic changes they have. I'll talk a little bit about my heart attack and my conversation I had with the cardiologist. So 2 days after,
Let's talk about that, because that's been an interesting ongoing conversation with us and your cardiologist.
right? Yeah. So 2 days after Ironman Blue Ridge, Virginia, which was a terrible race for me, and hindsight's always crystal clear. So I figured out why afterwards. But I had a heart attack. Now, fortunately, being a pharmacist, and every year I have to recertify, I know the signs of a heart attack by heart. And the thing that was hugely significant in me having a complete, and I mean 100% complete recovery, is how fast I got treatment. When the signs started, I told my daughter, take me to the hospital, because in the time it would take the squad to get here, we could already be there. And within an hour of symptoms starting, I was in the cath lab getting things fixed. So, but the conversation I had with, I know the doc was gonna put me on a whole bunch of drugs, and I had to have you, okay, look, doc, you got to explain me why we're doing this. Well, the first thing he says, I'm going to put you on a statin. And he smiled and he says, but not for cholesterol. He said, because there is scientific proof that in the first several hours and days after a myocardic event, the statin neutralizes some cytokines that
It's
are,
hidden for inflammation reduction under
yeah,
those.
inflammation and things.
Yep.
But I told him, I said, look, I don't want to be on this forever. I have spent, 4 years now changing my particle size of my cholesterol from the small particle to large particle. And a lot of the statins predominantly lower your good, the large particle size. If you want, I can do a quick run on Dr. Cuccizella's explanation. Is he used to talk about BBs and cotton balls, and at his seminar, he said, "I'll ask you two questions. If we took a plastic pipe and we ran BBs through it under pressure, how many hours would it take to shred the pipe?" Said question number two, same pipe, same pressure. If we run cotton balls through that pipe, how many years will it take to shred the inside of the pipe? Well, with your cholesterol, you have BBs and you have cotton balls, whether it's your LDL or your HDL. And your goal is, if you can change half your BBs into cotton balls, they can't shred the inside of your pipe, meaning the inside of your vessels. So through OFM and really my training and watching what I ate and staying away from the carbs, I changed my LDL cholesterol to 75% cotton balls, or 75% large particle size. On the HDL, I changed it to 50-50. Well, with the statins, and depending on which statin the doctor chooses, the degree of change can be significant, but they predominantly lower your cotton balls. So if you have a high HDL and we knock, in my case where I'm 75%, if you knock down my LDL, but I'm lowering my cotton balls, you actually made me worse. And the same with the HDL. So
and there's a whole host of side effects of long-term statin.
Oh yeah, yeah. I mean, the brain has to have cholesterol to function. So you can't take it down too low. So we agreed on the statin that I would only take it in that period where the neutralizing the cytokines and reducing inflammation. So I took it for 3 months, but then you fortunately sent me a very interesting study done in Japan of over 2,000 participants using a compound called natokinase. Now, the nice thing about the one thing that is no room for argument is natokinase is a blood thinner.
I actually call it a blood viscosity regulator.
Right.
Because
which is a better term.
Yeah, it's much more subtle than, say, the pharmaceutical blood thinners. Because like Coumadin, warfarin, it's thin your blood. That's what it does.
Yeah. Well, interesting. So after a heart attack, everybody will be put on Plavix or clopidogrel, And the mechanism of action of nattokinase is very similar to clopidogrel. So,
that's interesting.
Yeah, so the cardiologist allowed, right off when we started. And the one thing that I wanted to match the dose in the study you showed me.
Yep.
Because
that was
very low.
Like a 12,000 FU dose, right? Which is quite a.
Yeah, it works out to 594 milligrams.
Yep.
So I duplicated that dose. So I was able to stop the clopidogrel. And on the dose, that higher dose is the one that gives you the positive changes in your cholesterol. And what interests the cardiologist significantly is not only did it raise the HDL, but it raised the large particle size, the cotton balls of the HDL. And he said with him, he's not used to working with athletes. Most of his patients walking to the bathroom is exercise. And he says, I have a huge challenge getting their HDL up. So if nattokinase can do what the study says it'll do, he says, I got about a dozen patients right now that I'm going to put it on. And
well, good for your doctor, because that's going against the narrative and the business model, right? Because there's no money in nattokinase.
Well, I found out when he agreed to allow me to do this 40-miler that his brother is a big-time ultra guy who does 100-mile races and multi-day races. So I guess he's more used to dealing with crazy people that come to him with some alternative therapies. And then I guess we should get into the spike protein part.
Well, let's before we do that, I want to also provide some more context and background. Now, you said that your big block of training before the Ironman, you just were dragging and not feeling it, right?
Yeah, it was. I used TriDot, which really structures your training based on your data. So I was feeling like I was overtrained, but with the training platform, it was accommodating for that. So I just felt stale. My swims felt bad. The bike was pretty consistent, but the runs, I just didn't have the sharpness there.
And you weren't making gains, right?
No, I was maintaining, but usually, through the taper phase before a race, you start feeling like you got to hold back. And I was struggling to train, not realizing that probably that was because of significant inflammation in my cardiac tissue and probably the beginning of a plaque forming in one of my arteries.
Oh, well, or worse, I just saw a study yesterday that came out of Germany, and it's behind a paywall. But as the data comes out, it was showing the mRNA does some really, the term they used was funny things to the inner wall of the heart.
Well, yeah, the one of the funny things is in males it goes after predominantly their heart tissue. In females, it predominantly goes after their uterus,
their reproductive tissue.
Yeah, and we're seeing, you're seeing some really strange conditions that are baffling the doctors. I have one of the girls who works for me, one of my go-to technicians, is probably going to have a hysterectomy because they can't figure out what's going on with her uterus. And, she
get her on the nattokinase and serpentase.
Yeah, and she, like me, we were required to get our COVID jabs to be able to work.
Now, let's for the audience, remember when you said to me, you sent me an email, you want an OFM Vespa success story? Here it is. I had a heart attack, and I was just picked up the phone and said, what was my first question?
The first was, how old are you? And I told you, I said, no, what's your training age? And he said, and then you asked me, what group what age group is significantly affected by spike proteins in cardiac tissue? And I went, I think it's 30 to 50-ish. And you said, no, now it's 20 to 50-ish. And I said, oh, great, my training age is 50.
Yeah, but remember, I also, when I asked you if you got jabbed, you said that was my first thought.
Mm-hmm.
That you,
yeah. I mean, I was saying, hey, this shouldn't happen in somebody as well trained and as metabolic efficient as I am. I said, something's going on.
Yeah.
And
Now, were you already, I don't know, I'm the guy with the tinfoil hat on, so I'll wear the tinfoil hat, but were you already starting to see other people having cardiac events in large numbers?
oh yeah,
Okay.
one of my son's best friend, who is only 30 years old, now has full-blown congestive heart failure. And he's a 30-year-old guy. And I mean, and even in the pharmacy, we're seeing people that are on medications that they're too young to be on now. And when you start seeing numbers like 35% or there's a 35% increase in cardiac problems, as the doc said, in that age group of 30 to 50.
Yeah, and you fit into that metabolically.
Yeah, and so we're seeing it in the pharmacy, and it's scary to think that our big pharma is investigating mRNA. I won't call it a vaccine because it's not.
It's a gene therapy.
It's an immune system modulator, and
Yeah.
they're looking at mRNA immune system modulators for other diseases. And I said, this stuff is crazy. You don't know what it does, and we're just now beginning to see what I think is the tip of the iceberg.
Yeah. I read in when it first started to hit the thing. I read quite a bit about it and the history and Caitlin Karinko's research, and it's fascinating. She should have won the Nobel Prize for it, which she did, but for the wrong reasons. They said, "Oh, it's so people can get vaccinated," but her work was stellar work. But I have insights with my friends and my former wife who were in PhD doing basic research. A lot of what happens in good basic research is you learn it doesn't work.
Yeah, but one really interesting thing that happened by accident. If you look at the Scandinavian countries, nobody under 50 got a shot. Not because they knew about side effects. They just didn't they had a very limited supply of vaccine, so they gave it to the most vulnerable. Now,
which is
looking
what
back,
I advocated for with my friend Bruce. We have these discussions. Why don't we go for a surgical approach for those who have risk reward? Just like with statins, I think statins are overprescribed because there's other things you can do to get your metabolism working right, so you don't have the cholesterol problem. But if you're at imminent risk of a heart attack or just had a heart attack, like in your situation, you take a statin because it will save your life.
right?
And the risk reward for short-term use of a statin is life-saving, right? Right, that balance, but long term, not so much.
Yeah, absolutely. And even now there's some new protocols, like they tell you if you think you're having a heart attack, chew up an aspirin. Now they're saying, and if you have a statin around the house, chew that up with it, because in those beginning hours it can be huge to your survival.
That's right.
But you don't need to be on them for 30 years.
Right. And but so back to this mRNA stuff. It's an amazing concept, but it's not ready for prime time. And that's becoming very obvious, but it's also, it may not ever be ready for prime time. We may just learn some things that there might be some other interesting insights we can get from it, but it may not ever be something, because I think we're, in, this the human condition to try to dominate and control things. I just, as a biologist, I look at biology from the standpoint of a systems approach that, like, life biology, it really thrives in a chaotic environment. Out of that chaos comes an order, and we're supposed to understand and mimic it, because everything in biology is different, right? Every individual is different. Every pebble of sand, every leaf, every tree, there's subtle differences. We're all the same, we're all different, right? But nothing's exactly, and humans try to replicate and make things precise, and we forget that, in that quest for control and precision, we forget that sometimes you got to have some leeway.
Yeah, we're always looking for a quick fix.
Yeah.
We want the quick fix. We don't want the journey to get there.
That's right. That's right. And just realigning ourselves with those natural evolutionary pressures that shaped us as humans, because we have robust health. We just have kind of moved away with it, with all these tools and conveniences, right? We don't, we have cars, we have houses. We don't have to walk 10 miles a day or 20 miles a day, right?
Right. Yeah. But the one thing I was impressed is how much better I felt after starting the nattokinase and then the serrapeptase, by neutralizing those spike proteins and getting all that junk and inflammation out of my system.
Yep.
I just felt so much better. And, again, hindsight, looking back with a partial blockage, the reason I was tired is I wasn't getting enough oxygen and blood pumped out to the places it needed to go.
So and your doctor said you've made a complete recovery.
100%. So I had an initial echocardiogram that showed what the cardiologist said. It's like a bruising of the heart. He said if somebody hits you really hard in the shoulder, it doesn't totally damage your shoulder. It just has a nice bruise, and eventually the bruise will go away. In your instances, your heart was significantly bruised. And then when we did the repeat after, taking all his drugs and then starting the nattokinase, when we did the repeat echocardiogram, everything was 100% back to normal. He said, I'm not going to say you're good. He says, it's excellent, your recovery.
Have you ever seen that kind of level of recovery before?
He said rarely. I mean, I kept telling him, you got to treat me like I'm a 56-year-old guy, not a 71-year-old guy. And he said, well, the changes are even better than 56 that you've had with that echocardiogram. And he said, I listened to your heart. He says, it sounds perfect. He says, there's no murmurs. There's nothing that leads me to believe that you haven't had a absolute 100% full recovery. And, the scary thing is, had I not gone OFM several years ago, I probably wouldn't be here with having this conversation. I would have been one of the Hughes statistics that hardly made it out of their 60s.
Yeah. This is an interesting thing because, you got on it when you found you were doing endurance sports and developing blood sugar control issues. And like you said earlier, you get your glucose stable and consistent. Everything else seems to work right.
Yeah, I got a real interesting graph that I saved from my CGM. So I was doing a pre-race rehearsal, and I had to do an 80-mile ride, and I had my nutrition absolutely dialed in. And so with me, I have a very set 70 is the bottom. You can't change that. But my top level is 130, which is nothing. And that's my green line.
That's nothing when you're doing athletics. Yeah.
Right. And I try to keep it, I try to keep it as straight, flat as I can. And I mean, it's just this little wavy line right in between the green. 2 weeks later, I ran out of Vespa, and I ran out of one of my strategic carbs that I use. And during that, I was all over the place. I mean, you could see when I took what I replaced my strategic carbs with, you could see it go up, and then I go down, and it go up, and it go down. And the whole thing was, I had just these brief moments where I was within the lines, and it felt terrible. And I said, at parts of it, I'd feel pretty good, and then I'd feel bad. And you could see it drawn out on a CGM. Well, here's where I felt good. It's nice and flat. Here's where I felt really good when it spiked up, and here's where I felt terrible when it crashed down.
So in other words, the CGM data corroborated how you felt.
Yeah. It was exactly. So the ride that was awesome, I was right in between the green lines the entire ride. The one that felt terrible, I was in it, out of it, up, down, all over the place.
And that's interesting because that's one of the things I say about Vespa and fat adaptation. It makes your blood sugar stable.
Yeah.
And so not only for the physical effort to supply the energy, but blood sugar stability is key for motor function, mental focus, and fine motor skills. Because you actually lose your focus and fine motor skills well before you sense the fatigue. So before you sense it, you've lost that what they call that edge, and that's a big thing, is keeping that blood sugar stable. Now, the big thing here for the audience to understand is the reason James has it stable isn't because he's trying to manage his glucose. He's trying to optimize his fat metabolism, because the more you get that fat burning going, the less your glucose is going to fluctuate. Because as you know, as a pharmacist, glucose is very tightly controlled. Normal fasting blood sugar in a human amounts to 1 teaspoon of glucose as blood sugar in your cardiovascular system. So it's very tightly controlled. It can go up and down. And this is why pacing your blood sugar is sort of going to drive you insane.
Yeah, for sure. It's, one of the things that a friend of mine who's a performer really helped me. His take on Vespa, he says, if you ever walked into a live performance, and as you walk in, there's this guy sitting at a soundboard, and it has these switches, knobs, buttons and everything. He said, with the right guy on the soundboard, even you could sound good up there on stage, which I can't sing if I had to. And he said, Vespa is the guy at the soundboard, flipping the right switches, pushing the right button, turning the right knob to keep that fat burning going. That's going to keep, making us sound good or performing well.
Keeping you nice and stable.
Yeah.
Well, that's great to hear. And then, so you made a full recovery, and you're back to training, I take it?
Yeah.
Training for the 40-mile race, right?
Yeah, I'm starting my training for a 40-mile. It's actually one of the most challenging 40 miles on the East Coast. I'm going to do that end of March. So I'm about 6 months out, so I'm starting the training here.
Any triathlons in between?
No. Part of the, when I was cleared to start training, a couple of the triathlons that I actually wanted to do were already full. So, I'm going to still probably swim one day a week. I love getting out on the bike, especially in the fall. So I'm going to do that one day a week, and then I'll just see what happens. March is very early in the season, so there may be some opportunities to to do a triathlon later in the mid-season. But also, if I do well and really enjoy this 40 miler, there's another big race right in my area, the Grindstone, and they have yeah, they have 100 miler that I know the mountains they go up, but they also have a 100K, which is a 60-mile, and it bypasses one of the big climbs in the 100-mile race. But I may look to that, but they also have some shorter distances on some of the trails that I do anyway. So I may look at that. That's in September.
The JFK 50 mile is a good one, and that takes place right before Thanksgiving.
Mm-hmm.
That may be too close for you now, but maybe next year. And that's right across the river from Mark.
Yeah. And there's another 50 miler that's less than an hour away from my area too that I might look into. I want to get the first one under my belt to see how I do then before I start picking ultra races.
Okay, well, we should talk about some specific training, OFM training, to add into your training program to really help you get the bounce on that.
Yeah, you sent me a nice kind of format for a half Ironman, and but that was prior to the heart attack. I don't think my head is into right now doing another triathlon yet. I want to.
Yeah, no, but I can send you some stuff.
Yeah, I just want to do something different. And hey, who knows? Maybe I'll do a multi-day event.
Oh, the multi-day stage runs where it's not huge miles, like Jesse Haynes just won the Moab 240.
Mm-hmm.
You saw that?
Yeah, saw that.
Yeah, and that's the second year in a row a Vespa OFM athlete over 50 has won the event. In the 3 out of the 4 years, it was all Vespa OFM athletes. So, but they've got all these stage races, which out here in the West, that's starting to grow to be a thing where you run sections with a partner and it's like 10, 20 miles, not huge distance over 6 days. And that seems to be really a nice venue.
Yeah, I could see that because I've done bike trips like that.
Yeah.
Are a lot of fun,
Yeah, you definitely get a good workout in, but it's not like a race where you're just done by the end of the day for the next week, right?
Right, yeah, for sure. Yeah, the one thing about Vespa that's been so significant for me, and I've said this multiple times, is if I can keep my head in it, I can make my body do anything. And with the focus and the concentration you have when you're burning fat as opposed to sugar, allows you to do extend because you haven't lost the concentration and focus piece of it.
Yeah. So let's also talk about the lifestyle. Other than that this lifestyle, the OFM lifestyle and Vespas really gave you the robustness to be on top of your myocardial event, and recover fully from it. But what's it like for people? Because I think a lot of people have misconceptions. They think it's a keto diet or a low carb diet, and it's like you're tracking macros and you're counting calories and you're like staying away from certain foods. I mean, what would you have to say to that?
So
now that you're like 18 months into it.
Well, yeah, now I'm 4 years into it.
4 years into it. Yeah.
Yeah, but I can tell you, my wife kind of plays around with the same thing as well. She's not an athlete, but she likes the way it makes her feel. And we typically for Christmas and Thanksgiving, you go on carb overload, all that stuff that that are traditional foods. And Thanksgiving never has been bad because it was just one meal. But Christmas, we have a kind of a family breakfast, a lunch, and a dinner. and which has certain foods that, you know, are okay to enjoy occasionally, but you don't want to live off of them. Well, you know, like Christmas, after Christmas was all over, that next morning when we woke up, my wife looked at me and she says, "I feel terrible." And I said, "Yeah, me too. Just think this is how we used to wake up every morning." So, it isn't restrictive. The nice thing about OFM, once you become fat adapted, there's wiggle room. And like, uh, Dr. Mark Uccizella said with it, using the CGM, he says, saw teeth are good, humps are bad. So you eat something you know is wrong, but you are out with friends, you enjoy it, you know, it goes up in a point, but your body now knows how to manage that sugar, and it secretes enough insulin to bring it back down to baseline. So you get this spike. It goes up, your body recognizes it, comes down. What's bad is when you eat something and it goes up pretty high, but it's a hump, and your body struggles to get it back down. He says, that's a food that you probably should avoid, but it also means there's something that is causing your body not to recognize that and take care of it. So when you learn those foods, there's a lot of things that you think are bad for you that are not, and some things that you think are good for you that are not. But as you become more and more fat adapted, you're not going to get, even if you eat more carbs than you should, your body is able to handle it and take care of it and bring you back to baseline really quickly.
Yeah. And that's what we call building metabolic capacity, because when you build your metabolic capacity, you're building your mitochondria, which takes place on fat beta oxidation, which is the true fat burning state.
Right.
And you're also improving your cell wall lipid bilayer, which is the transit point in and out to get to the mitochondria. Those are the two biggest points. I mean, every organelle and organ and piece of a cell, the cytoplasm, they're all vitally important, but the two biggest things are that cell wall, and because that's also a point of big inflammation, and then the mitochondria. And when you build that metabolic capacity, you get the metabolic flexibility, you get the carb tolerance, and you also stay somewhat sensitive to insulin. And the other thing is when the only way you can build a lot of mitochondria and big mitochondria is through fat metabolism, and one of the lead ups to that is oxygen. So developing your cardiovasculature, which means getting the inflammation down, getting it fat burning, because you have to, to burn fat in beta oxidation requires twice the oxygen per ATP as glucose. And this is, one of the things when they talk about the Warburg effect in cancer, that it's aerobic glycolysis. So as the cells have less oxygen carry capacity to the cells, you shift from beta oxidation to more glycolysis. And then as you go to more glycolysis, you just don't have the potential, and you have the demand for more glucose. So it's like you really got to build that up, and exercise is one of the big levers, and it's not just aerobic exercise, it's aerobic exercise combined with tempo, combined with intensity, resistance, because those are all huge signaling mechanisms to increase aerobic capacity and metabolic capacity.
Right. Yeah, and it's been huge in not only my training but my racing.
Yeah. So what would you say to athletes out there, whether they're cyclists, runners, triathletes, CrossFitters? I mean, you've got a particularly unique perch for being a pharmacist and being in healthcare and seeing what's going on in that realm, to being an athlete yourself and having had this recent health event and the one you had 4 years ago that got you on this journey.
Well, one thing is don't just rely on the drugs. to fix the problem. Go
This
to
is
the
coming
root
from
of
a pharmacist, folks.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I make my living by selling you people drugs, but don't rely on that as your first line of defense. Try to fix it. You know, I see people that I went to high school with come in, and the list of their drugs are like, oh my gosh. And then my second, oh my gosh, is that would be me if I hadn't have done this. So, you know, they don't feel good, they don't look good, they don't have the energy and everything, and they're keeping alive through drugs. I'd rather feel good, do all the stuff I want. You know, I, People look at me and says, 70 years old and you're doing full Ironman. I said, yeah, now I'm going to do a 40-mile trail run. It's gonna so. Uh, you take the drugs when you have to manage an acute condition. You don't want to use the drugs to manage a chronic condition.
Well,
But
and this goes to another point we probably should stress, because you said, like you say, people look to the drugs for convenience and treat the symptom that's in front of them. And a lot of times the drug is treating a symptom and nobody's getting to the root cause.
Right. Yeah.
Right.
And that's a change from the way medicine used to be to the way medicine is now. We're not looking for cures anymore. We're looking for customers.
Yeah, and I think this is something important for the audience to recognize. It's what you don't see you need to be worried about and focusing on, because I do those deep dives, and it's like that's why I lose people, because it's the stuff they don't see and feel up front, right? But it's at that root cause, and it's like as soon as somebody's out of pain or they stop bonking, they forget about it till the next bonk, right?
Yeah, for sure.
Got an ache or something, and then like in the terms of pharmaceuticals, a lot of times you take a statin, well, it gets your cholesterol where it's quote unquote supposed to be, which I'll argue, I won't go into, but I would argue that. But then all of a sudden you develop high insulin and diabetes, right? Or
right,
muscle aches, or a whole host of things. So you really got to go to that unseen thing. I mean, use the drugs if you're in an acute situation to get you out of that hole, and that's where they're a miracle. Modern medicine, literally, a miracle for acute situations.
I mean, there's some infections that antibiotics are a total cure for, and some of them aren't even around. And you look at when there is a true need, yes, go with your doctor. But for these long-term chronic things, don't always look for a drug as your first line of defense.
Yeah. Yeah. And like you said about metabolism, and if your blood sugar is stable, everything else seems to work just fine, right?
Yeah. And like one of the tests that the cardiologist agreed to do is did a fasting insulin on me. It was 2. Yeah.
Yeah. Remember, I told you to get that.
Yeah. A guy my age isn't supposed to have that kind of fasting insulin. I'm supposed to be insulin resistant, and
Well, 4 years ago you were.
Yeah, I was. I know. 4 years ago, I would have been afraid to look at what my fasting insulin was, and I get reminded almost daily when my buddies come in to what I would be on had I not gone this route.
Yeah. Yeah. And you're 71 and still doing these big endurance events and don't plan to stop, right? It's still fun, right?
Right. Yeah. So my kids got me a T-shirt. It says "Growing older but not up."
Yeah.
So as long as I haven't grown up, I'm going to keep doing these things.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Yeah. That's great. Well, James, thanks for sharing your story. Any other last words for people out there?
Well, one thing going back to the shot and the spike proteins, fortunately, there are compounds that can neutralize those spike proteins. You're far better if you're concerned about COVID. Use your natural immunity. every one of us now have some degree of it. But using the nattokinase, not only do they degrade the spike proteins, it's going to make you feel better, help your cholesterol better, and keep your blood thin enough that you don't have to worry so much. And the serrapeptase directly neutralizes those spike proteins.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
if you've had the shot and you've had a couple boosters, talk to Peter and get some of those things cleared out of your body, and you'll feel better like I do.
Yeah, and here's the thing for everybody out there. It doesn't matter whether you're getting spike protein generation from COVID or from these therapies. What's happening is you're getting a huge internal and inflammatory response. And what I learned early on and took a lot of grief for was as soon as they had the code out, they sequenced the gene or release the sequence. I think they may have already kind of known it, but I looked at the sequence and all that and looked at the primary literature and said, oh, okay, this is a run-of-the-mill. It's kind of a middle-of-the-road coronavirus. But what made it so deadly was the furin cleavage site, which made it really transmissible. So even though it wasn't that lethal compared to SARS-1 or MERS, it was way exponentially more transmissible. So it was just a numbers game in terms of more people would get it, which means more people would have serious outcomes or succumb to it. And to a point, and please give your thoughts as a pharmacist, but to a point, when you looked at the data early on throughout the whole panic, what I call the panicdemic, up to the rollout of the vaccines, from that initial January, February 2020 through the end of the year, the people that were having bad outcomes were just metabolically unfit. Multiple comorbidities, hyperinsulinemia was literally a death sentence. Because it really allowed the virus to replicate, because viral replication is glycolytic. So if your cells are primed to burn fat, it's just not as hospitable as a cell that's primed to burn sugar. So the people that were dying and getting serious outcomes were people that just weren't metabolically fit. So it was really, the COVID was really what pushed these people over the edge. They were sitting on the precipice and getting ready. So that's my thing.
Yeah, and that's what I've seen. I've had one close friend that actually died from COVID, but he was a heavy smoker. Metabolically, he was a mess.
Yep.
And unfortunately, he was more like the typical 70-year-old person, and he just got overwhelmed from it.
Yeah, but and so the mRNA therapies that are out there are just bringing, the concept was by generating spike protein, you generate an immune response, but it was supposed to be localized in the arm, and it kind of got out of hand, right? And you're one of those people, because of your metabolic fitness. If you were a 70-year-old guy, a typical guy, you probably wouldn't have had that from the spike protein, because you're immunosuppressed, so you probably wouldn't have generated that.
Probably very much true.
But you die of something else, like COVID.
Well, that's right. I just spoke to one of my Boy Scout leaders who just turned 102, sharp as a tack, and I says, now I want to get to that point and go out in style.
There you go. So and for right now though, you're gonna keep going out and crushing it in life on the bike, on the run, and swim.
Correct. Yeah. So as long as it's fun, and now I got a new area of fun to try. Let's see what ultras where that can take.
Oh God. Welcome to the dark side.
Yeah, for sure.
So, well, you'll keep your cardiologist entertained between his brother and you.
hmm And he said now he has two crazy people to take care of.
Well, okay. Well, James, thanks very much. And keep us posted.
Okay, thanks a lot.